Hello, everyone, and welcome to your final lecture in Introduction to Psychology. Today, we're going to be looking at personality, and we're going to be looking at two trait approaches in detail. So, we're all aware of the word personality, but what is personality? Well, it comes from the word from Latin for persona, meaning mask. So basically, your personality is the mask that you wear. It refers to an individual's characteristic patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior, together with the psychological mechanisms, hidden or not, behind those patterns. So basically, it is the mask that you wear that guides your pattern of behavior. It can be defined as consistent behavior patterns and intrapersonal processes originating within the individual. So personality is consistent, it remains relatively stable over time. And it basically refers to our attempts to capture or summarize an individual's essence, or that which is consistent across situations over time. Now, there are 6 different approaches to personality in psychology. The psychoanalytic approach, the trait approach, which we will look at in a lot more detail today, the biological and evolutionary approaches, the phenomenological, or easier, humanistic approach, the learning approach, which is behavioural and social learning theories, so like modelling and reinforcements, and finally the cognitive approach. But as I said, today we're just going to be looking at the trait approaches, with just a very brief summary of all of the other approaches. So the first is the psychoanalytic approach. So this is the perspective of the Freudian perspective, and they believed that your personality was guided by your unconscious mind and your unconscious motivations. And for Freud, these were your libido, so your life force, and also your death force, so your sort of guidance towards life, towards those positive energies, and also away from death. But that these motivations are unconscious, and these are built upon your childhood experiences. He also believed that you are attempting to resolve conflict between within your tripartite personality, which is your id, your ego, and your superego, and that resolving this internal conflict also guides your personality. So, for example, if your ego feels particularly stressed and you engage in an ego defense mechanism such as regression, then that will guide your behavior. The second is the trait approach. Now, we're going to go into that in a lot more detail in the rest of this session, but this basically looks at how people differ and conceptualizing and measuring these differences using a continuum of traits and behaviors. This will make a lot more sense after this lecture. We're going to go through 2 trait approaches, and one of them in particular will be particularly important for your exam, which should be released. It's either already been released or it will be released within the next couple of hours. The third approach is the biological and evolutionary approach. So basically, anatomy, physiology, inheritance, and evolution. So if we're talking about extroverted personalities, then how they developed over time and how they benefited us in an evolutionary way, but also inherited dispositions. So if your parents are very extroverted, then you might also be very extroverted, and this is associated with different activity levels in the brain. So, for example, with extroversion, that's associated with different levels of cortical activity. So, the fourth approach to personality is the humanistic approach. This is a conscious experience of the world, and where basically personality is associated in this perspective with personal responsibility and free will. So personality is literally just down to the individual. It's not evolution or biology or modelling. It's what the individual has been born with, and how they interact with the people around them that shapes their personality. The humanistic approach also assumes that people are good and have an innate desire to make the world around them better. So basically, your personality develops in a way that will make you the best fit for those around you and the best fit for improving the world in general. The fifth approach is the learning approach, so behaviorism and social learning theories. So this basically encompasses the theories of behaviorism and cognitive personality theory. And basically, you learn to adapt your behavior as a result of rewards and punishment. So, conditioning and learned behavior. So, if you are extroverted and you are regularly rewarded for being extroverted with things like social status and friends, then you're more likely to be extroverted. However, if you exhibit introverted personality traits and people like you because you are relaxed, quiet, reserved, then you'll be rewarded for that as well. So basically it depends on the pattern of reward and punishment. Finally, we have the cognitive approach as a whole. The cognitive approach assumes that differences in personality are explained as differences in the way that we process emotion. So we all have the same stimuli, the same stimulus, but the way that we respond to that, the way that we process that information, will depend on our personalities, and how we respond to that will be determined by our personalities. So the cognitive approach assumes that people are who they are because of the way they think, attend to perceive, analyze, encode, and retrieve information. And their mental organization, so the way that they do these, is their characteristic cognitive pattern. So this ultimately is their personality. So that was a lot of information, but don't worry about it too much. That was just an overview of the 6 different approaches to understanding personality within psychology. But for the purpose of this module, for the purpose of your exam, we're not going to be looking at most of those approaches. We're just going to be looking at the trait approaches. So before we do, let's define some key terms. So personality is a person's unique and relatively stable behaviour pattern. So the consistency of who you are, who you have been, and what you will become. Now, for example, let's use introversion and extroversion just throughout this lecture as our example. With extroversion, you're generally either an extroverted person or not. If you're introverted, then in some situations you might be a little bit more confident, but in general you are an introverted person. You also don't tend to go from introverted to extroverted or vice versa, so your personality is stable over time. Your character is these personality characteristics that have been judged or evaluated. Your temperament, that involves hereditary aspects of your personality. So this is what you inherit from your parents. Now this can include sensitivity because these are sort of biologically based characteristics, moods, irritability, and adaptability. And finally we have personality trait and personality type. So a trait is stable qualities that a person shows in most situations, whereas a type is when someone has people who have several traits in common. So several people will have that personality type, and then personality trait is those individual stable qualities. So now types and traits are very similar. In fact, they can have the same labels. So someone might say that someone has an extroverted personality type, whereas someone else might say they have an extroverted personality trait. So here is the difference. Personality types are categorical. You are either introverted or extroverted, or you are neurotic or psychotic. However, so it assumes that each of us fits into one category type and that all people who fit within that category are basically alike. So basically all extroverts are similarly extroverted, exactly the same, and they are very, very similar in their personalities. And that each personality type is very different from all other personality types. For example, an extroverted person and an introverted person will not be very similar at all. Now, we kind of know this not necessarily to be true. All extroverts aren't similar, and extroverted tendencies don't even necessarily display themselves in the same ways. So the trait approach kind of acknowledges this, because according to the trait approach, personality traits are continuous. The trait approach categorizes people according to the degree to which they manifest particular characteristics. So, whereas personality type, you can either be extroverted or introverted, so one or the other, it's like binary. With personality traits, it's more a continuum, it's a scale, a spectrum, so you fall somewhere between the two. People's unique personalities are explained by having a relatively greater or lesser amount of the traits that are consistently found across people. So everyone has levels of extroversion and introversion. You all fall somewhere on the scale. If you are incredibly introverted, then you'll fall closer to that side. If you're very extroverted, you'll fall closer to that side. But usually we fall somewhere in the middle. So now that we've sifted out all of that other information, let's really focus on our trait approaches. So what is a trait? Traits are dimensions of individual differences in tendencies to show consistent patterns of thoughts, feelings, and actions. Now, this definition is by Costa and McCrae. These are some very important people within the trait approaches in psychology, and so their definition is the one that we will go by in this module. So basically, traits are consistent patterns in the way that people think, act, and feel. Now, the trait approach examines the relationship between personality characteristics, thought, and behaviour. And basic views are shared by trait psychologists. Traits are fundamental building blocks of personality, and traits can be organised. So for the rest of this lecture, we'll discuss different traits and how they might manifest in our behaviour and how they're organised. Now, these are some typical questions that trait researchers like to consider. How many personality traits are there, and what are they? Are personality traits stable predictors of behaviour across different situations? Do personality dispositions change over time? And where do the various personality traits come from? Now, these are the questions that you might like to consider when we are doing the personality seminar. So when you come into the uni and we'll have a look at different trait approaches and how they are measured, then these are the kind of questions that I'd like you to consider in your groups. So maybe start to have a think about those now. Now, there are two major assumptions of the trait approach. The first is that there are personality differences between people, but that these differences are relative rather than absolute. You see, we all share the same traits, and you can't be truly zero on anything. So let's say we're looking at introversion and extroversion again. You cannot be 0% extroverted and 100% introverted. You fall somewhere on the scale where extroversion is this side and introversion is this side. The composition or pattern of traits varies from person to person, because of course we don't just have one trait. There isn't just introversion and extroversion. There are many different traits to consider, and so your personality will be made up of being this much on the introversion scale, this much on the openness to experience scale, this much on the neuroticism scale, and that makes up your personality. The trait approach tries to measure the degree to which a person is more or less sociable, dominant or introverted, compared with someone else, so compared with typical norms and averages, rather than trying to measure these traits in any absolute sense, so by either saying you are introverted or extroverted. And yes, as I was saying before, personality, so your overall personality, consists of patterns of traits which form unique combinations in each person that is stable over time and across situations. So depending on where you land on each different subscale of personality inventories, we'll say your specific and unique combination of traits. Now we'll have a go at some of those personality scales in the seminar, so you guys can have a look at how we calculate those different personality traits. So we talk about the trait continuum. This is the space between one absolute personality characteristic and another absolute personality characteristic. For example, extroversion and introversion. Any personality characteristic can be illustrated with the trait continuum. A wide range of behaviours can be represented on this. For example, achievement motivation. You have highly persistent on one end and indifference and no drive at all on the other extreme. And it might be an idea for you guys to think about different behaviours that you might be able to represent on a continuum. For example, trustworthiness and untrustworthiness, or something like that. So because of this, traits are bipolar, as in they are, you can be polarized in those traits. You either have one end or the other end, but you can also have anything in between. For any trait, there is an opposite lying on the same continuum. For example, high optimism and low optimism. And each person has to be placed somewhere on that continuum. So you're either a very optimistic person or not a very optimistic person or somewhere in between. But you can't remove the concept of optimism from your life. If you're not optimistic, you're simply lower on the continuum. So basically, these traits are, or the trait continuum, is somewhere where everyone lies on every trait. So all traits can be described on this continuum, and the continuum shows either end of the trait. So let's have a look at the emotional stability continuum. So we have neuroticism. This is what it's called in the Big Five and by Eisner. We have emotionally stable on one end and emotionally labile on the other end, and in between you have where people generally fall. So for me, I would say that I'm pretty emotionally stable. I can be a bit anxious sometimes, so I'm probably falling about 2/3 of the way or 3/4 of the way towards emotionally stable. And then we have optimism. So you're either optimistic or you're pessimistic. Now, me personally, I'm very rational. So I'm very neutral on most things. It's very situational, depend like whether I come across as optimistic or pessimistic. So I would say my optimism is neutral because it's entirely based on situational factors. I'm not someone who's particularly optimistic or particularly pessimistic. So how do we decide where we fall on each trait continuum? Well, people have more or less of a trait by demonstrating behaviour either more or less frequently. So with the emotional stability continuum, I am very stable most of the time. I get anxious sometimes. With more or less intensity, so I don't really get incredibly anxious, I don't get incredibly neurotic. So again, I'm closer to the emotionally stable. And then often or rarely across a wide range of situations. Again, vast majority of situations I'm pretty stable. Sometimes I can get anxious, but it's still the general consensus is that I'm pretty stable on that continuum. So therefore, traits can be distinguished from states. Now, I am generally a very sort of emotionally stable person, so my trait is further towards that end of the continuum. However, this doesn't mean that if I am having a particularly anxious day, if I'm feeling particularly neurotic, that my personality state changes, that my trait changes. That simply means that my state changes. There's a difference between trait anxiety and state anxiety. Traits are enduring and stable over long periods of time and across situations, so being an anxious and neurotic person, whereas states are brief and situation specific. So I get anxious at job interviews, for example. So therefore, we can say that even if someone does experience anxiety, they can still be an emotionally stable person because that anxiety is a state. Okay, so we've covered what traits are and how they differ to states and types. So now let's start discussing the trait approaches. Now, the essential trait approach attempts to reduce large numbers of traits to a few traits that are essential to understanding personality. However, important questions remain today. For example, what traits are basic or essential to personality? Does that not differ between people? And how many essential traits are there? The debate continues, but we're going to discuss a couple of trait theories now that attempt to discuss a couple or up to 5 basic traits for personality. Now, these essential trait theories are underpinned by psychometric theory and factor analysis, so they're very scientific and have gone through a rigorous process to identify these traits. However, they can be complicated because labeling of the traits is subjective. For example, one theorist might refer to a personality trait as emotional stability, whereas another might refer to the personality trait as neuroticism. These are, however, referring to the same personality type, so it's important to understand what the trait is describing when you are reading about these theories. We need to understand the meaning that underlies the trait, rather than simply looking at its name. The first theorist that we're going to discuss is Hans Eysenck. Now, he developed one of our key trait theories to understanding personality. His theory emphasizes 3 second-order factors, and he calls these supertraits. He believes that these supertraits are genetically determined, and he focused on temperament, so the emotional, motivation, and non-ability related cognitive aspects of behavior. So basically, Eysenck believed that you inherit specific supertraits from your parents, and these are related to your temperament and your motivation, and then different aspects of your environment. So this nature-nurture debate gets involved. So different aspects of your environment will depend on your traits, and then habitual responses, and then specific responses. So we'll have a look at that in a few slides. So Eysenck's model of personality is based on these 3 supertraits, and these are referred to using the acronym PEN. These supertraits have a hierarchical structure, and they're broad traits that subsume a large number of source or narrow traits. So again, we'll go over that more in a few slides, and we'll see how those narrow traits fit into those supertraits. So PEN stands for psychoticism, which is at the bottom, extroversion, and neuroticism. So extroversion is the extroversion versus introversion continuum. High extroversion means you have low levels of cortical arousal. So basically, if you're a very extroverted person, then your brain actually has lower levels of physiological arousal, and that's why you attempt to get more stimulation from your environment. However, if you have low extroversion, if you're introverted, you have very high levels of cortical arousal, so you don't need to get so much more arousal from the environment, and you tend to be quieter and more reserved. Then we have neuroticism versus emotional stability. High levels of neuroticism mean an excess amount of activity in the autonomic nervous system, so you literally just feel more nervous. There's no need to bark. You literally just feel more activity in your nervous system. And then we have psychoticism. Now, psychoticism is a tendency towards psychotic or sociopathic behavior, and that is associated with differences in the brain. So as you can see, all of these super traits are associated with things that you can inherit biologically from your parents. So let's go through these super traits one by one and see how our different subtraits and habitual responses fit into each of these super traits. So the first we'll look at is extroversion to introversion, with introversion being people who are quiet and shy and enjoying solitude, whereas extroverts are more likely to be outgoing, loud and sociable. So the extroversion-introversion continuum results from an imbalance of inhibition and excitation in the brain itself. So basically, extroverts have less arousal in their ascending reticular activating system. So this is a structure in the brainstem that controls overall cortical arousal and acts as the gateway to arousal. If you are high in extroversion, then you're likely to have low levels of cortical arousal. So you have lower levels of activity in this aras. The Aras system of extroverts allows too little arousal in, and therefore they seek sensation in other ways by behaving in an extroverted way, and therefore gaining that stimulation that they need in order to be satisfied. Introverts, however, people who are high on the introvert scale, are believed to have very high levels of cortical arousal. So these higher levels of arousal in their Aras means they are having too much arousal in their they're having too much cortical stimulation. And so introverts seek out contexts with low stimulation. And so therefore we could say that this extroversion and introversion super trait is associated with cortical arousal, which is a biological trait which can be inherited from your parents. So this extroversion introversion super trait would stand at the top of this hierarchical structure of super traits. You then have 3 or however many more traits coming off from that super trait. So these are more aspects of your behavior that are consistent. And this super trait and other consistent aspects of your personality, these traits, will have associated habitual responses to specific events, and then even more specific responses to those specific events. So as we can see, this hierarchical, this super trait that we have inherited from our parents, it trickles down to our very specific behaviours. So how do these super traits and narrower traits look for the extroversion and introversion super traits? Well, let's say that you are extroverted. So that is your super trait. We then have all these other different traits that are associated with your personality. So if you're extroverted, you might also be generally sociable, lively, carefree, and venturesome. These are the traits of your personality because they're stable over time, but they're not these super traits. Now, these narrower traits will result in habitual acts, which are level 3, so at the bottom. Now, these habitual acts might result in, for example, if they're associated with being sociable and lively, might be associated with regular party going. So if you're an extrovert and you're sociable, regular party going might be a habitual act, and then a specific act for specific parties, you might be someone who dances on the table. So, and then we follow that back up. Dancing on the table is therefore associated with extroversion. So we can see how these behaviours fit into these super traits. And how would this look for neuroticism? Well, first of all, what is neuroticism? And this is people who score high on the neuroticism scale. They're not necessarily neurotics, but they're more susceptible to neurotic problems. Some people, so these people with higher neuroticism, have a more responsive sympathetic nervous system, so limbic system. And this controls their emotional responsiveness to emergency situations, so your fight or flight. People who are high in neuroticism are basically just very ready for their fight or flight response all the time. High levels of neuroticism arise from this hypersensitivity, excessive activity in your sympathetic nervous system, and you're more reactive to threatening situations, which might explain why you get more nervous, more anxious, and more fidgety. These might be associated with being neurotic. Now, an archetypal neurotic symptom is a panic attack. So this would be associated with your fight or flight responses of being overstimulated. However, in the face of a stressor, in the face of a threat, I'm not sure that a panic attack will particularly be a good survival mechanism. So with neuroticism as our super trait, what traits might be associated with that? Well, here we have being tense, anxious, quite depressed, and with that we have our habitual responses. So with neuroticism, this might be overthinking and ruminating, with our specific responses, so lower to that, possibly being snappy and argumentative or having panic attacks. So having high levels of neuroticism can actually not be particularly healthy. And so it's these people with higher neuroticism who are more likely to have different levels of psychological disorders. A lot of the research with neuroticism has focused around PTSD. Holeva and Tarrier in 2001 studied victims of road traffic accidents across 2 time periods, with the baseline being 4 weeks post-accident and then the follow-up being 6 months post-accident. Neuroticism, and to a lesser extent psychoticism, was associated with a development of post-traumatic stress disorder. So high levels of trait anxiety, so neuroticism, appeared to increase the risk of developing PTSD. So we can see that our personality has a big impact on our mental health. The last trait, the last super trait of the Penn theory is psychoticism. Now, psychoticism was added later and is less researched. It's developed from research conducted in psychiatric institutions and prisons, because people in those situations are more likely to have high levels of psychoticism, and so there must be another end of the scale as well. So Eysenck researched this and added psychoticism as a super trait, because people are either going to be to have high levels of psychoticism or lower levels of psychoticism, and it's important to identify those as well, particularly in the criminal justice system. Now, psychoticism is a tendency towards psychotic and sociopathic behaviour. And high scores on psychoticism, on the psychoticism measure, indicate a certain recklessness, a disregard for conventions, a degree of inappropriate emotional expression, a tendency to be hostile, manipulative, and impulsive. So these you might call our traits that are associated with psychoticism as our super trait. Here again we have the hierarchical structure of the psychoticism super trait. So if psychoticism is at the top and you score high on psychoticism, here we have our lower traits that might be associated with this, such as being aggressive, cold, and egocentric. Now, our habitual behaviours, if we are psychotic, might be to fight regularly and have violent outbursts, and our specific responses might be to argue with friends and relatives. Now, in order to measure these 3 super traits, Eysenck developed the Eysenck Personality Questionnaire. Now, this gives a score as to where you fall on each continuum once you complete the questionnaire. And research has been conducted on using this questionnaire and comparing this questionnaire to other behaviours. So these are a few examples. Extroverts are more likely to have sexual intercourse at younger ages and with more partners than introverts. Introverts tend to demonstrate superior academic achievement, and this is found in both Western and non-Western cultures. And individuals with high extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism are more likely to engage in criminal activity. So scoring highly on all of those super traits is actually more likely to be associated with criminal behaviour. Now, the final trait approach that we're going to discuss today, and the approach that's going to be important for your exam, is that of the Big Five. So the Big Five personality perspective. Now, these Big Five refer to 5 super traits of personality discovered by McCrae and Costa. Now, these are openness, so openness to experience. And if you're high on openness to experience, you have a tendency to be unconventional and an independent thinker. Whereas if you're low, you're more conventional and prefer the familiar rather than the new. So people with autism, people with Asperger's, are more likely to be low on openness to experience, as people with autism are less likely to be happy to be unconventional and think by themselves. They prefer the familiar rather than the new. Second is conscientiousness. So conscientiousness measures control and self-discipline. Those who are high in conscientiousness are likely to be controlled and organised, whereas those who are low are more likely to be careless, easily distracted, and undependable. Now, there is a gender difference in conscientiousness, with women being more likely to be high in conscientiousness, whereas men are more likely to be low in conscientiousness. Next, we have extroversion. Now, again, we know extroversion like the back of our hand by now. A high extrovert has tendency to be sociable, energetic, and assertive, whereas being low in extroversion, so being introverted, you're likely to have a tendency to be reserved, independent, and even-paced. And again, this is associated with physiological cortical arousal. Next, we have agreeableness. Now, if you're high in agreeableness, you're more likely to be helpful, trusting, sympathetic, and cooperative. And if you're low in agreeableness, then you're likely to have a tendency to be antagonistic and skeptical. Finally, we have neuroticism, or negative emotionality. Now, people who are high in neuroticism have higher levels of emotional distress and swings in emotions. Now, again, this is like emotional stability. And people who are low on neuroticism tend to be calm and well-adjusted. Again, these trait scales operate on a continuum. So you can't be specifically one or the other. You land somewhere on the continuum for all of them. And the your different sort of landings on each continuum helps to mold your personality of these 5 super traits. Now, you might notice that neuroticism and extroversion are pretty identical to those described by Eysenck, and that's because they are. They discuss the exact same personality traits. I mean, you're not going to have one person discussing personality that says that extroversion doesn't exist, because we all know that it does. And quite the same with neuroticism. People are generally either neurotic or you can't really not have neuroticism on there. You're going to fall somewhere on that scale. Now, the 5-factor model is commonly measured by the NEO-PI. Now, this is more commonly known as the Big 5 Personality Inventory. And using this, each of the 5 super traits is measured by 5 subordinate traits. So, for example, being hardy versus being vulnerable, being unemotional compared to being emotional. Longitudinal studies of these 5 factors have shown that when they are measured in school children, that these behaviours, these traits, are stable over time. And just like with Eysenck's Penn personality theory, the Big 5 personality theory has also been associated with various different behaviours. For example, people high in extroversion are more likely to exercise more and drink more alcohol. People high in conscientiousness get better grades and are more honest. People who are high in openness are more likely to play a musical instrument because they're more open to this experience. And highly agreeable people are consistently found to smoke less, so that's an interesting one. And in fact, the Big 5 personality theory has also been investigated in consideration for job performance as well. If you are high in conscientiousness, then you are likely to have good outcomes on all levels of job performance criteria. If you're high in extroversion, you're more likely to be in a management or leadership role, and you're very good at sales, which again, you could probably predict that. Openness to experience and extroversion predicts training proficiency. Again, if you're proficient in if you're very open to experiences, then you're more likely to go head on into training. And if you're agreeable and neurotic, then you're more likely to then your performance is more predictable when working in groups. So you're more likely to take a back seat in group work. Now, of course, like any theory, the Big 5 personality theory is not without its problems. Now, it has been shown to be relatively consistent cross-culturally, but 5 problems remain in that they're not always the same 5, and nor are there always 5. So generally, we still have extroversion and introversion. We still have neuroticism and stability. But in some cultures, there are more super traits, and in some cultures, there are less. And this brought Briggs in 1989 to come up with the psychology theory of the Big 5 plus or minus 2. And this generally covered all different aspects of personality cross-culturally. In addition to there being cross-cultural differences, there have also been found to be consistent sex differences on 3 of the big 5. For example, women score more highly than men in neuroticism, so they're more likely to be neurotic, they're more likely to be agreeable, and they're more likely to be conscientious. But again, evolutionary psychologists would probably have a lot to say about this, because it's the women who historically, back when we were cavemen, would have been nurturing relationships between people. And so being agreeable and conscientious is probably going to be the women who are agreeable and conscientious are probably going to be those more likely to reproduce, because people are going to want those around in the tribe. So again, this also feeds back into our understanding of evolutionary psychology. Further problems are that the fact that the big 5 traits, albeit with some variation, keep popping up again and again, irrespective of what measures are used and populations studied. And this has led to the claims that these traits make up the essential structure of personality. But there does seem to be more to personality than just these 5 traits. And so it's quite a simplistic model to explain something as complex as personality. For example, you could summarize the trait authoritarianism as a combination of high neuroticism, high conscientiousness, low openness, and low agreeableness, but that actually seems to miss the essence of the construct. And it also fails to account for authoritarian characters being deferential and agreeable with those of a higher rank, but mean and nasty to those of a lower rank. So again, it's difficult to the big 5 doesn't necessarily cover everything, but it's kind of difficult to think of a proper substantial trait that would add to this that couldn't be just sort of torn to shreds. Now, that's it for the lecture today. Your exam, if it's not already been released, will be released very shortly. 5 questions will be released. 1 question will be on the Big 5 personality theory. So I do hope that you found that short section of the lecture interesting. Do more research into that in your own time as well, in your independent study. But of course, out of those 5 questions, you do only have to choose 2 questions to answer. 500-word answers for each question, please, with 1,000 words overall. And you've got a week to submit. So thank you very much, guys, and I will see you next semester.